Let's just see how many art history buffs we have here in our church. Just curious, has anyone recognized the drawing over the last 2 weeks? Anyone? Just, you can shout it out if you recognized it. No one. Robin would be sorely disappointed. Robin, she drew it, but she drew it, it's actually a sculpture by a man named Bernini out of the Baroque period, and it's of David. You probably recognize the more famous David sculpture. It's David with him just letting everything kind of hang out. He's kind of sitting there like this with the sling out, and he's naked. just butt naked. You probably remember that. This one, the one that we're doing here is different. This one came after Michelangelo's David. Again, the artist's name is Bernini. And he did it for a guy named, there's probably a way better Italian, but Southern, it reads Borghesi's house. I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. I probably could have looked that up before I got up here. But he has this there in the house, right? It's still on display. Now, Michelangelo's David, 17 foot tall. This guy here is a little more life size. He's 5'7", though he is on a pretty large little pedestal, so you still have to kind of look up to him. The big difference in the I guess the sculptures is Michelangelo's David, he's just kind of chilling. He's got a sling and he's sitting there and he's waiting. And this one, you can't see the bottom of it, but he's getting ready. And in the full version of it, he's got a sling on the ground and he's about to take what's in his sling and hurl it at someone, which we're going to talk about in our story today. And it's also interesting that at his feet in this particular sculpture, there's a ton of armor that looks like it's king's armor that's sitting at his feet, almost like he took it off and put it on the ground. And so what Bernini was able to capture was the entire story, for the most part, in just a few simple images. You can see on his face this look of determination. You can see in his eyes that there's a focus at what he's kind of zeroing in on. I think what we want to do at the end of today, when we wrap up our gathering this morning, if I can help you take even just a small step closer to having that kind of focus, if I can help you figure out what a sling is good for, if I can help you load that, or at least pick out what needs to go in it, I think we're in a better place. That's what we're aiming for this morning. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we tend to find ourselves in a place where we end up looking like Michelangelo's David, where maybe we encounter God and we encounter the Bible, and our response to it, our reaction is just, well, that's nice. But I think maybe there's a challenge for us to come to a different posture at the end of today. One where there's an ability for us to take action. One where we recognize a foe in the middle of battle and we do something about it. We're finishing, or I guess in the middle of our series on the life of David. It's a tiny series. It's 3 weeks. It's over next week. And so we picked 3 stories to share with you out of the life of David. And really, you probably could spend 3 years going through his entire life, and you still would probably leave some details that could add value to our lives out. And so we just chose 3. This one is probably one of the stories that's known far and wide, even outside of church and Christian circles. It's a phrase that's used in the sports world over and over again, David versus Goliath. It's a true underdog story unless you have proper context. From the outset, it looks like, hey, there's going to be this tiny man fighting this large giant. But as you will see, Goliath actually has a little bit of insight into what actually is happening, and we'll jump into that in just a second, that we miss. Goliath knew something that we, even though we've read it, sometimes forget. Let me give you our setting. Right now, the people of Israel, they wanted a king. And so 20 years before the event we're going to talk about today, this David and Goliath battle, 20 years before that, God said, fine, here's a king. His name is Saul. And so there was this king, and 20 years later, God has gone to Saul, and he says, hey, here's the deal. I've got a few specific things that I needed you to take care of. Saul, he decided, no, I'm not interested in following your directions to the T. I'm going to follow most of them, but I'm going to take a little bit of liberty on my own. And because he does that, God says, hey, no more. No more. I'm not interested in you being the king of my people any longer. Your days are numbered. I will replace you. Because when I put you in a place of leadership to lead my people, to lead my kingdom people, and you get this kind of stuff wrong, when I directly speak to you and you say, yes, sir, and you go out the door and you do exactly the opposite, I'm not going to stand for it. And so last week, Jason told us the story about how David, this little shepherd boy, the youngest of 8, is sitting in a field, and his father doesn't even want to bring him before the prophet Samuel to be anointed as king. He goes through brother by brother and says, no, not him, not him, not him. Finally, he looks at Jesse and says, Jesse, surely you have another son. He says, yeah, I do, but he's the runt. He's out in the field. You're not looking for him, are you? And he says, yeah, bring him. And he comes before him, and he anoints David as king. We fast forward just a little bit, and that's where we find ourselves. An unsettled king who knows his days are numbered. And a little boy who's probably a teenager now that understands what God has for him is more than simply tending his father's sheep. And that's where these two worlds collide. We pick up, if you have your Bible this morning, you can follow along, or I would encourage you just to simply mark it, and you can go back and read the story in its entirety, verse by verse. It's a pretty short little story. But if you want to mark it, it'll be in the book of 1 Samuel 17. That's going to be in the Old Testament, the first little half of the Bible. There's a 2 Samuel, so if you find anything that says Samuel, you're close. Just flip back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and you can mark it. I'm going to read a little bit from you, but when I read, it'll be on the screen. And so I'm going to begin with how the story begins, chapter 17, verse 17 through 19. It says this, now Jesse, which is their father, David's father, said to his son David, take this, I can never remember this word, ephah, what was it? Ephah, thank you, sir. Ephah. The southern just comes out sometimes. I can't read nothing. Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brother and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. And so David is hanging back out of the house. He's hanging back out of the house, and his father says, hey, you know what? I haven't heard from your 3 brothers, 3 of your older brothers in a while. Why don't you take them some food? Why don't you take their commanding officer a little bit just to maybe stay in his good graces? Take them something and then come back. I just want to hear a progress report. They're busy. They're there with Saul. They're on the front lines, and they're fighting the Philistines. And so you go check it out, take that stuff, and then come on back to me. Now what happens is David hurries off. And it's not too far of a journey. In fact, the Bible tells us that he left early in the morning and he arrived at the battle lines that morning. And so it wasn't that far of a journey. And then when David shows up, he begins looking. There's a ton of battle-ready men there. Anyone over the age of 20 in the nation of Israel would be on the front lines if they were physically able. And so there's tons of people, and so he's trying to find his brothers. He's kind of on the lookout, and he's probably got this little red wagon he's pulling behind him. I don't know how he got the bread and cheese there, but he's got something, and he's pulling it behind him, and he's searching, and then he hears something. This deep, dark voice begin to shout. It's not a voice that belongs there. It's not a voice that he recognizes. It's not a voice that he admires, where maybe he had heard war stories of the people of Israel in the past. It wasn't one of those voices. This was a foreign voice. The voice was mocking his people. The Bible tells us his name was Goliath, Goliath of Gath. And he stands there on the other side of the battle lines, and he's mocking the people of Israel. The Bible tells us a little bit about Goliath. He ends up being, dependent on how long the measurement is from your elbow to the tip of your fingers, because that's kind of how they measured things, anywhere from 7 to 9 feet tall, this giant. He wears 125 pounds of armor. His spearhead is 15 pounds, and he stands there with all of that, mocking the people of Israel. You see, at this point in time, it was a fairly popular way of doing battle where you would send one champion against another champion, which would eventually, at least in theory, save bloodshed. We would say, hey, we're going to send our best fighter, you send your best fighter, and whoever wins, it's winner take all. Now, unfortunately, throughout the historical record, we find that this happens outside of the Bible, and most of the time, when the person loses, they still fight, like all of it. And it rarely works. We're like, okay, you're right, you beat us, so now we're slaves, right? It never happened. But that's what they're attempting to make happen here. And so Goliath is this champion. The Bible also tells us that Goliath isn't holding his own shield. He's got a shield bearer that goes with him into this battle, that's holding it, walking with him back and forth, taunting the Israelites. And so David's hearing it, and he's trying to think, what's happening here? Why are we just sitting around doing nothing? Why are we sitting around doing nothing? You see, David knows what Goliath also knows, which is the thing that we tend to forget. You see, it wasn't just you send your champion and I'll send my champion. You see, Goliath, even though he was from a country that did not know God, what we would call a pagan country, Goliath also recognized that the gods would be fighting through them. That it was absolutely within the realm of public knowledge that champion spoke for the God of those people. And so Goliath is saying, there's not a chance I'm going to lose because our gods will not abandon us. Yet the people of Israel stand on the other side, scared to death, unable to send a champion of their own because they have forgotten that God fights for them. They had forgotten that God had chosen them. They had forgotten that God had not forsaken them. They had forgotten that they actually were who God said they were. That they were the children, the people of God. And they stood on the opposite side of the battlefield shaking. I find it interesting that this young guy shows up and suddenly he's motivated to action. He hears this mocking happen, this mocking of the people of Israel, the army of Israel, and it motivates him to do something. I guess the first question for us this morning is, what would it take for us to be motivated? What is it that could occur or happen in our lives that we would say, you know what, enough's enough. Enough's enough. I am who God says I am. I am a son, a daughter of God. And I don't have to sit here and listen to the enemy hurl insults at me over and over again. That if I have the ability to do something, I can do it, not because of my talent or gifts, but because God fights with me, for me, through me. What is it that would motivate you? Where is the line in the sand that you would draw and said, well, once you step over this, I'll step into action? For David in this particular instance, it was shame. He felt ashamed. He was ashamed that none of his brothers had stood up. He was ashamed that the people, the army that he looked up to, that he grew up admiring, and these leaders and these generals were just standing there doing nothing. He was ashamed, and so he decided, okay, well, that's it. I've got to go do something. Now, shame can be a pretty interesting motivator or demotivator. Because what we see is that David feels some shame here. He's ashamed of how things are happening, so it causes him to act in a positive way. But we also see that Saul has shame, and he's acting in a negative way. He's decided, because he's been rebuked by the prophet, by this Samuel guy, when he didn't follow God's directions, when he said, hey, I'm going to go almost to exactly what you asked me to do, God, but I'm not going to quite take care of the details at the end because I think I know better than you. Suddenly, when he gets in this situation, he's hesitant. Whereas if you were to fast forward or rewound just a little bit, I mean, it was nation after nation. Bring them on. We will take them one as they come, two if you got them. And suddenly there's this stopping point where he says, I just don't know anymore. I'm just not sure. Yet God specifically told him to take the Philistines. He continues to doubt. How does shame motivate you? Does it cause paralysis? Does it cause you to second guess God? I think the thing is that shame, when we feel it, that guilt that's inside of us, that should be temporary. It should not be this long-lasting motivator. The moment we feel shame and guilt, we should turn to Jesus and say, hey, can you take care of this for me? Because I know I want to be who you say I am. And I know children of God should not walk around in shame and guilt, that we should feel it and experience it because that's part of the human nature, but then we should turn it over and ask for forgiveness and walk forward in confidence that the rest of our life, that the days in front of us will not be defined by the sins and mistakes of our past. Saul is stuck, though, in this place where he can't move forward. He doesn't know what to do on his own. From a physical standpoint, he himself doesn't have an idea of how to handle it. And he's convinced himself he can't talk to God about it either. That's a dangerous place to be. When you make that decision that your sins are so large, that the shame is so heavy that you're embarrassed to say it in front of the Almighty God. Thankfully, God puts people around us. In this case, he's going to allow David to shed a little bit of light on the situation. David decides, I will have an audience with the king. And so he goes in front of Saul and he stands and they begin to have this conversation. And David says, send me. My hand's raised. The rest of those guys out there, they're all hands like this or like this or like this. But I'll go. And Saul's like, no, kid. You're a boy. You're just a boy. And it doesn't tell us exactly how old David is, but he's not 20 years old yet. So he's a teenager. He's just like, no, you're a boy. And did you see the guys that you walked past to get in my tent? Those men are warriors. If they're not raising their hands, clearly something is disconnected in your brain. David responds. He says, no, nothing's disconnected in my brain. Maybe my brain is connected to my heart, and the heart belongs to Jesus. In fact, David says this, 1 Samuel 17 through 37 says this, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. David begins to tell the story. He said, no, I get it. I'm just a boy, but I watch my family's sheep. And so there was this one time when this lion and this bear, they tried to get these sheep. And they actually put it in his mouth. They started walking away with it. And so I went and I tapped him on the shoulder. It doesn't say tap him on the shoulder. It did say that he hit him. And then all of a sudden they turned around and they let it go. And they're like, all right, well, if you want something, let's go. And he said, I stabbed him with a knife. So look, lions, tigers, bears. Oh, my. No, there's no tigers. There's no tigers. He said, bring it. Bring it. I think it's important when we find ourselves up against giants, when we find ourselves in front of obstacles, when we find ourselves in front of mountains that we just don't think can be crossed, that we remember your victories in the past have prepared you for fights in your future. That's the truth. Now you might say, well, I don't have many victories in my past. I don't know if you have to have many. I think one will do. And if you are who God says you are, if you are a child of God, I can already tell you one victory you've had. And that's the moment you said no to Satan and yes to Jesus. That's the moment you said, hey, put me under. Let me be united with Jesus in his death through baptism and united with him through his resurrection by being brought out of the water. That's a victory. That's a foundation to begin. You might not have ever experienced the temptation or the issue that you're running through before in your life, or maybe it's owned you your entire life. And that's okay. We're looking for something for you to recall this moment of victory, this moment of success where you can say, you know what? I can do this. David is what we call in the Bible a Christ type. In other words, he gives us a really good picture, a foreshadowing of who Jesus would ultimately be. David does this in a myriad of ways, but in one of these ways in particular, I want us to kind of think about this next little sequence in the story. And finally, Saul says, okay, you've killed the lions and the bears. I'm going to give you a shot at this giant. And so he says, but before you go, I'm going to put my armor on you. I'm going to give you my king's armor. And so he puts it on him. But Saul's a grown man. In fact, he was quite the grown man. And so this armor swallows David. So much so that he's kind of walking around like this. Maybe not like that. Enough to where he has to take it off. He takes it off and he lets it fall to the floor. He says, no, I'm just going to go as a shepherd. And I think the thing we've got to pull from here is that David shows us how Jesus takes care of our problems. And sometimes we want Jesus to take care of problems in the way we want. We say, hey, well, here's some things to help you solve this for me. Here's my armor, won't you put it on? But Jesus doesn't fix our problems the way you think he ought to fix them oftentimes. Oftentimes he goes to battle for us in ways that cause us to be a little uncomfortable. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Saul to stand there on a hillside and watch a teenager go out and do the hardest job of his life, one that probably Saul should have been doing? Can you imagine the shame that continues to kind of fill his heart as he stands on the mountainside and he watches this little boy walk towards a giant with the entire fate of the people of God in his hands? It's not how Saul would have drawn it up. It's not how he would have put it together. Yet that's what God decided to do. When we look at David's preparation for this moment, David spends a little time alone. He goes down to a stream and he gathers, it says, 5 smooth stones from a creek bed. Now, typically, I don't know if you've seen it, but Walmart's got these slingshots. You can go buy them. It's got little yellow things and a piece of leather, and they've got these white marble balls that you put next to it. I had a friend, I don't think he's here today, but he's told me this story one time. He was a delinquent when he was a teenager. He's given me permission to tell this, where he would take fishing weights and drive down the road and take that slingshot and shoot them at people's car windows as they went by. That's a really bad idea, kids. Don't do that. He escaped prison. He didn't really escape prison. He didn't go to prison, but he probably should have. He's a good guy now, though. Praise the Lord. We're not talking about that kind of slingshot. Specifically, in this particular part of the world at this time, we're not talking about little tiny marbles or fishing weights. We're talking about rocks the size of a tennis ball, a grown man's fist. If you know the story, you know that it only took one. That he bends down or kind of goes back, and I don't know how you get a sling to work. I don't know if he was rodeoing the bad boy or what and just let it fly. I don't know. But just one, and you wonder, like, well, how did that one little rock right in the forehead of Goliath make him fall? Well, it wasn't a little rock. It was this. I mean, he just didn't have a forehead when he was done. There was just a rock there. That's what happens. He begins to walk towards Goliath. He's got his 5 smooth stones from the riverbed. Sometimes people will say, why did he take 5? Did he not have any faith? Nowhere in the Bible does it say where God says, hey, just get 1 stone. It's going to be 1 shot, 1 kill, right? You know what I'm saying? That wasn't that. He didn't know. Was it going to take 4, 3, 2? Was he going to have to kill him and then the armor bearer was going to come running after him? He didn't know. He got 5. He said 5 should do the trick. There's thousands of you. I'll take 5. God will take care of the rest. As he walked towards him, all of his preparation starts coming back into his mind. I'm sure he remembers the bear and the lion. He might even have the conversation with Saul where Saul says, you're too small to do this. Maybe doubts begin to sink in. But David had prepared. Preparation is important when we talk about going into battle. Preparation is important when we begin to head on or take head on the temptations and the issues in our life. I had a professor once tell me this. He would say, prepare like it's all up to you, but take action like it's all up to God. That you do everything on your power, on your end, to make sure you've got your stuff together. But that you walk into the situation knowing at the end of the day, God, this is yours and I'm yours. I belong to you. This situation is going to belong to you. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do everything in my power to prepare. But at the end of the day, I'm just surrendering it to you. In the battle, as I mentioned earlier, it ended up being just one shot, one kill. And the giant came a-tumbling down. It says that he went over to the giant after he fell on the ground. And he took the giant's sword. He cut off his head. He raises it. And the Philistines retreat in the opposite direction. And the people of God follow. I guess the thing we really need to talk about this morning is, what's your giant? You see, Goliath had a spear. He had a sword. He had a shield. Those were his weapons. That's what he intended to use to inflict harm on David. What does Satan use with you? I don't think Satan comes at you with a sword. Maybe he comes at you with pornography. I don't think Satan comes at you with a shield that could crush you if he threw it on top of you. Maybe Satan comes at you with gossip. Maybe it's slander. Maybe it's jealousy. Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's the inability to get past the sins and mistakes in your past. What is the weapon that Satan yields as he approaches you? What is it that when you see it, when you hear it, when you think about it, when you're in discussions about it, makes you think, you know what, that one could kill me? That one's powerful enough to take my life, and I'm going to start backtracking a little bit. What causes you to back up? What causes you to consider retreat? What is it that Satan brings at you that causes you to forget that you are a child of God? Whatever it is, maybe I can encourage you to write this verse down. Maybe you can commit this one to memory. So that the next time that you find yourself alone in your house and you're sitting in front of your laptop and you're thinking, this is probably not a good idea, but your hands just have habits and they continue to take you to a place where you know you don't belong. And the next time it's late one evening and you know I've got nobody here to hold me accountable. We're just going to sit here and have a good time. And who knows where it ends up? When it's quiet and you're in your office and you figured out how to get away with it. And it's just a little bit of money here and a little bit of money here. And it's foolproof. They'll never find it. When those things happen, maybe you can remember this verse. It's there in chapter 17, verse 45. It says this: "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Can that be a reminder for you? That as David and Goliath, as the tiny guy up against the giant, as they come face to face, as they come right there into the moment where they've got to figure out who's going to win or lose, that deciding moment of battle, maybe you can remember, all right, bring it, enemy. I see what you're coming at me with. I can tell you what it is. I'll define it for you. I know how much it weighs. I know how you'll use it to kill me. But can you remember that you come at him with the King of Kings? God of the people of Israel, which we are now included in, that we are co-heirs with Christ? Can you pull this out of your back pocket and say, hey, here it is? You see, giants should not become symbols of defeat. They should become a reminder that victory through Jesus is coming. I'm telling you the truth. When those things that continue to change and wreck your life show up, typically our kind of disposition becomes, here it is again. I just can't say no. I want to say no, but I just can't say no. Can we reframe them so they become reminders that, no, this is something I can have victory over. This is something I can overcome through Jesus. This is something I can defeat. This is something I can put on the ground. This is something I can cut its head off. This is something I can pick up and show victory over. Can you allow it to become a sign that victory can come? The welterweight champion of the world, 1901-1904, is named Joe Walcott. He was the first ever recorded to say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Some say one of the greatest welterweight boxers to ever walk the earth. He was known for fighting men outside of his weight class. In fact, he searched for it. He would give sometimes up to 25 pounds to his opponent and still come out victorious. How about you? Are you willing to take on the giant in your life? Or have you just given up and said, no, it's just going to beat me? I'm just going to stand here on the sideline and listen to it taunt me day in and day out. What is it that will motivate you to finally say, let me respond to the shame and guilt in my life in a positive way as opposed to a negative way? What is it that will get you to a place where you say, you know what, enough's enough. I'm ready to take it on. Here's a cool thing. Because remember, Goliath knew this. He knew that ultimately it wasn't champion versus champion, it was God versus God. And so when you decide you're ready to take on your giant, you don't have to take him on alone. You don't have to walk into the battle all by yourself. That it's doable for Jesus to go with you. When you think of your giant right now, you think it's like this massive thing that will surely destroy you. But maybe close your eyes for a moment. Just close your eyes. Picture that one thing that just keeps you separated. That one thing that just keeps you disconnected from who God wants you to be. The one thing that if you could get rid of it, you would take a large step towards being a better follower of Jesus. What is the one thing? And now I just want you to picture Jesus standing next to it. I don't know what color Jesus is to you. Maybe he's white, he's black. I don't know what kind of hair he's got. You get to make that up. Just picture him next to it. Picture him next to it. Saying, hey, we got this. This is doable. We can overcome this together. Picture him next to it saying, look, this doesn't have to define you. Picture him next to it saying, hey, this doesn't have to orchestrate the days of your life. Picture him next to it saying, hey, this isn't who you're going to be. Picture him next to it saying, hey, I'm giving you permission to go to battle with it. Picture him next to it saying, hey, I'm here already. Will you just join me in the fight? That's what Jesus wants for you. You won't find a single person who follows Jesus and has given their life that doesn't think Jesus wants you to get rid of the things that stop you from being a better follower of him in your life. He wants to do it with you. You just got to go meet him on the battlefield. Stop standing on the sidelines and being afraid. Stop hoping somebody else is going to show up and do it for you. Stop trying to figure out how does the armor fit. Just walk out there and meet them.